"If you have that baby, I'll destroy your family," Don Giovanni warned. But 3 years later, he saw her walking with a beautiful daughter. Some wounds run too deep to heal. Some betrayals shape your future in ways you can never escape. And on the night, Don Giovanni, the Italian Godfather, thrust a thick envelope of money across his polished desk and told Jane to make her choice. He unknowingly created the woman who would one day unravel everything he'd built. Jane stood in the center of his opulent office, her hands trembling against the silk of her dress, feeling the heavy weight of the secret she had been carrying, pressing down on her like a stone. The city sprawled beneath them, the endless lights mocking the darkness swirling in the space between them. She had imagined this moment countless times, envisioning his face softening, his arms wrapping around her, just like those stolen nights when his voice had promised her the world. But instead, Don Giovanni stood behind his desk with his jaw clenched, his eyes cold and calculating, replacing the tender lover with a ruthless businessman. The man who had once traced poetry across her skin now saw her as a problem to be solved. And as his hand slid the thick envelope toward her, it landed between them like the final verdict of a life irrevocably changed. The night in Don Giovanni's office was one that would mark the beginning of Jane's transformation. Standing before him, she was offered a brutal choice: end the pregnancy, and her life would go on as before. Keep the baby, and her family would be destroyed. Don Giovanni's power was undeniable, his reach infinite. Yet Jane's resolve was born of love and defiance. As she looked at him, eyes locked, she made a choice that would change her world. No longer would she bow to his demands. No longer would she let him dictate her fate. The introduction is a powerful moment of tension, revealing Don Giovanni's cold manipulation and Jane's quiet strength to protect her unborn child. The emotional stakes are high as she steps into the unknown, setting the stage for her journey of survival, vengeance, and ultimately, healing. The elevator doors slid open with a soft, mechanical hum, revealing the marble floors of Don Giovanni's penthouse office. Jane stepped inside, her heels clicking against the polished stone, each step echoing like the pounding of her heart. She had come here with a mission, a quiet resolve burning in her chest. Yet each step felt like a weight, as if the very air around her was pressing down. She had rehearsed this moment 100 times in her mind, played it over and over, but now that she was here, standing in front of the man who controlled her fate, she felt the weight of the world on her shoulders. Don Giovanni sat behind his massive, gleaming desk, his dark eyes never leaving her as she crossed the room. His silver hair gleamed under the harsh lights, and his tailored suit spoke of power, an empire built on cruelty and calculated moves. He leaned back in his chair, his fingers tapping the edge of the desk, his jaw set tight as if he had already decided what would happen. The air was thick with the unspoken tension between them, the history they shared, and the ultimatum that hung in the balance. He was cold, his expression unreadable. But Jane could see the flicker of something else behind his eyes. Fear? Regret? No. It was power. The unshakable belief that he could control everything and everyone around him. "You know what needs to be done," Don Giovanni said, his voice smooth, like velvet but laced with steel. He slid the envelope across the desk toward her, thick with money, his solution to her problem. He made it sound so simple. But Jane could feel the weight of it, each dollar representing a piece of her soul that he was asking her to sell. "I can't do it," she whispered, barely hearing her own voice. The words felt foreign on her tongue. She had been so certain, but now, standing here in front of him, with everything at stake, she could hardly recognize herself. She wasn't the woman he had once loved, the one who had begged for his affection. She wasn't the woman who would bend to his will, to his empire. Don Giovanni's expression hardened, and for a moment she saw the man beneath the mask, the ruthless Godfather who had destroyed lives without a second thought. "You don't understand, Jane. This isn't just about you, it's about your family, your mother, your brother. The consequences will be devastating. Do you really want to risk everything?" Her breath hitched in her chest, and for a moment she thought she might give in. His words, his threats, they were all too real, but then she thought of the life growing inside her, of the tiny heartbeat she had felt just days ago. She could hear it now, steady and strong, echoing in her mind. She wasn't going to let him take this from her. Not now, not ever. With trembling hands, she pushed the envelope back toward him. "I'm keeping the baby," she said, her voice strong, steady. It wasn't just a decision, it was a declaration that she would not be controlled, not anymore. Don Giovanni's eyes flickered, the mask slipping for just a moment. But it was enough. Jane could see the rage bubbling beneath the surface, the same rage that had driven him to build his empire on broken people. He didn't say anything. He didn't have to. His silence spoke volumes. Jane turned on her heel and walked out of the office, leaving behind everything she had ever known. She wasn't sure what the future held. She didn't know how she would protect her family, how she would keep them safe from the wrath of Don Giovanni. But one thing was certain. She would fight for herself, for her baby, for the family that he thought he could destroy. And she would not stop until she had built a life of her own, one he could never touch. Don Giovanni sat alone in the vast silence of his penthouse office, the only sound the steady tick of the clock on the wall. The envelope of cash still lay untouched on the desk, its weight a cruel reminder of Jane's defiance. His fingers drummed against the polished wood, a slow, deliberate rhythm that matched the pulse of his thoughts. She had refused. She had chosen her child, her family, over him, and in doing so, she had shattered the control he'd so carefully built. He leaned back in his chair, eyes narrowing as he watched the skyline of the city stretch before him, an empire he'd carved out piece by piece, a monument to his power. But Jane had dared to step out of that shadow. His empire, his very world, had been built on controlling the people around him, breaking them when necessary. But Jane had slipped through his fingers like sand. "She will regret this," he muttered under his breath, the words hanging in the air like a promise. He wasn't accustomed to being denied. His fingers flew over the keys of his phone, initiating the web of resources at his disposal. Private investigators, subtle, quiet surveillance. It wouldn't take long to track her down, to find where she had gone, where she had hidden herself and the child she had chosen over him. Don Giovanni wasn't a man who tolerated rebellion. He would find her, and when he did, everything she had fought for would burn to the ground. Jane woke to the soft sound of Viviana's giggles, her daughter's small hands reaching out for her as she rolled out of bed. The morning light filtered through the curtains of their modest apartment, casting warm, golden hues over the room. It wasn't much, but it was theirs. Jane had left behind the luxury, the high-rise views, the empty promises of a world built on power and manipulation. Here, in this small, humble space, she began the difficult work of rebuilding, not just her life, but her heart. Viviana was growing, her laughter a constant reminder of the life Jane had chosen, a life free from the chains Don Giovanni had tried to wrap around her. They spent their days at the park, running and laughing under the sun, their time together uninterrupted by the constant shadows of fear. Jane knew the cost of this freedom, but it was worth it. Every moment spent with her daughter was a gift, and Jane would never take it for granted. Meanwhile, far from Jane's world, Don Giovanni's empire was beginning to crack. His grip on his business was slipping, fractured by the chaos of his own making. The board meetings grew tense, his rivals whispering louder as his power waned. His every move, once calculated and flawless, was now riddled with doubt. He couldn't stop thinking about Jane, about her refusal, about the child she carried. The obsession gnawed at him, turning his calculated decisions into desperate actions. But no matter how hard he tried to restore control, Jane's absence, her defiance, lingered in his mind, an open wound he couldn't heal. His empire, once unshakable, now felt fragile, and he couldn't escape the growing sense of vulnerability. The walls were closing in. The sun had set over the city, casting long shadows through the apartment as Jane sat at her desk, a soft hum of concentration filling the quiet room. Viviana was asleep, her tiny body curled up in her bed, safe and sound. Jane's fingers danced over the keyboard, the words flowing effortlessly onto the screen. She had found a new rhythm, a new purpose. She was no longer defined by what she had lost. She was defined by what she had built. In the years since she left Don Giovanni's world, Jane had immersed herself in work, learning to navigate the business world she had once been so far removed from. With Viviana's future on the line, she had no choice but to become more than just a mother. She had become a force in her own right. She had started small, leveraging the little money she had left to invest in a startup that aligned with her values. The company grew quickly, its success propelled by her vision, her drive, and the lessons she had learned from Don Giovanni himself, though she would never admit that. With each deal she made, each investment she secured, Jane built more than just a business. She was creating something of her own, something that could never be touched by the man who had once tried to destroy her. She had become a queen in her own right, her empire growing steadily with every calculated move, every successful pitch, every investor who saw what she had to offer. She had learned to navigate the corporate world, a place once dominated by men like Don Giovanni, and now she was carving her own path. Meanwhile, miles away, Don Giovanni was losing his grip. The empire he had spent decades building was slipping through his fingers. His advisors were more distant, his competitors more aggressive. His boardroom was filled with murmurs of doubt, whispers that questioned his ability to lead, that mocked his obsession with a woman he could no longer control. His every decision felt like a misstep, and every move he made only seemed to tighten the noose around him. The Godfather's empire, once an immovable fortress, now felt fragile, as though the walls were inching toward collapse. The stress began to show. His meetings grew more erratic, his once immaculate appearance becoming disheveled, the sharp lines of his tailored suits now a reminder of the man he no longer recognized. His mind, once a steel trap, now felt clouded with the weight of his failures. He couldn't stop thinking about Jane, about Viviana, about the empire he had built and the one she was building without him. His obsession with her had consumed him, leaving him vulnerable, distracted. His rivals seized upon it, capitalizing on every moment of weakness. Jane, on the other hand, thrived. She had become a force to be reckoned with in the business world, her name known in circles where Don Giovanni's had once held unchallenged power. Her company was expanding, her wealth growing, but more importantly, she had found something deeper: peace, a sense of fulfillment. The empty, aching space that had once been filled with fear and anger was now filled with purpose. She had made it, she had survived, and she had done it on her own terms, with no one to answer to but herself and the daughter who had made it all possible. Don Giovanni, standing in his penthouse office, staring out at the city he had once controlled, could feel the weight of his choices. The world he had built was crumbling. And Jane, the woman who had once been a pawn in his game, was now playing a game of her own, one where he no longer mattered. The realization gnawed at him, a bitter truth he couldn't escape. The gala was held at one of the city's most exclusive venues, the kind of place where the rich and powerful gathered, their wealth on display as much as their smiles. Jane had been invited as a guest of honor, her growing reputation in business making her an asset to any event. As she entered the grand hall, her confidence was palpable, the poise she had built over the years radiating from her like a shield. She scanned the crowd, exchanging polite greetings, but her mind wasn't on the glittering chandeliers or the expensive wines being passed around. She was here for a purpose, to secure another partnership that would propel her company to new heights. She didn't expect to see him, and yet there he was. Don Giovanni stood at the far end of the room, surrounded by a circle of well-dressed men who seemed to hang on his every word. He looked exactly as he always had, imposing, commanding, with an air of effortless control. His dark eyes were sharp as ever, his tailored suit immaculate. But there was something different about him now, something that Jane couldn't quite place. It wasn't the slight graying of his temples or the weight that seemed to settle on his shoulders. No, it was something deeper, something she could feel even from across the room. The power that had once radiated from him so naturally now seemed like a shell, fragile and thin. As she took a step forward, their eyes met across the room. Time seemed to slow, the noise of the party fading as everything else fell away. Don Giovanni's gaze locked onto hers with the intensity of a man who had never truly let go. For a brief, fleeting moment, Jane felt that familiar twinge of fear, the cold calculation that had once governed her life. But she didn't flinch. She couldn't. His eyes darkened as he moved through the crowd, his path deliberate. Jane stood her ground, a tightness in her chest, her breath steady. He was closer now, too close. He stopped just in front of her, towering over her in that same intimidating way he had years ago. "Jane," he said, his voice low, a mix of familiarity and something else, something she couldn't quite read. "Don Giovanni," she replied, her voice steady but tinged with a hint of bitterness. There was a long, tense silence between them, as if the years hadn't passed at all, as if the walls they had built between themselves hadn't been torn down, but Jane had rebuilt herself since then. She wasn't the same woman who had stood before him in fear. "I see you've done well for yourself," Don Giovanni said, his eyes scanning her, though it was clear his focus never truly left her face. Jane didn't flinch. "I've built something that's mine," she replied, her words deliberate, a quiet strength in them. Don Giovanni's expression shifted slightly, his lips pressing together as if he were considering her words. He was silent for a moment, then spoke again, his voice quieter now, more personal. "And your daughter?" he asked, his gaze searching hers. Jane's heart skipped a beat at the mention of Viviana. She had never imagined this moment would come, never thought she would stand face to face with him, her daughter's existence hanging between them like a fragile thread. But here it was. Here he was, asking the question that had always loomed over them both. "She's with me," Jane said, her voice sharp, "and she's mine to protect." Don Giovanni's eyes flickered with something, surprise perhaps, or regret. He didn't speak for a long time, just studied her, as if trying to piece together a puzzle that had been incomplete for years. "She's beautiful, I'm sure," he finally said, his voice softer, the hardness in it fading ever so slightly. But Jane could hear the weight of his words, the acknowledgement that he had lost something precious, something that could never be replaced. Viviana was alive and thriving, and Don Giovanni was too late. She had already created the life he had once tried to destroy. "Her name is Viviana," Jane said, the name falling from her lips like a shield, a quiet declaration of everything she had fought for. "She's more than you could ever understand." For a moment, Don Giovanni just stood there, his expression unreadable. The years of power and control had not prepared him for this. His world of certainty shaken by the very thing he had tried to erase. Without another word, Jane turned and walked away, leaving him standing in the midst of the crowd, his empire crumbling quietly in the shadow. The days that followed the gala were a blur for Don Giovanni, his mind spinning with the echoes of Jane's words, her cold indifference, the name she had uttered, Viviana. It haunted him, lingered like smoke in the corners of his thoughts, refusing to dissipate. He had never imagined her child would exist, never considered the possibility that, despite all his power, she could build a life without him. But she had, and what's worse, she had done it without fear, without needing him. The reality of that burned deeper than any betrayal he had ever known. His evenings, once filled with meetings and carefully orchestrated business moves, now passed in a haze of unfinished thoughts and restless nights. He would sit in his study, the dim light of his desk lamp casting shadows across the room, and pore over documents, financial reports, competitor data, acquisitions, but none of it held his focus. His thoughts instead kept returning to her, to Jane, and to the child he had never seen. Viviana, his daughter. The thought struck him like a blow each time it resurfaced. He had known the risks. He had made his choices, and he had forced Jane to make hers. He had done what needed to be done, or so he had told himself. But now, looking back, he could see the cracks in his reasoning, the mistakes in his actions. He had underestimated Jane. Her resolve, her ability to break free from him, had never truly crossed his mind. He had been so consumed by his own power, so sure of his ability to control everything around him, that he had never considered she might defy him. The weight of it all began to crush him. The empire he had built, the life he had shaped, now seemed fragile, hollow in comparison to what Jane had created, what she had made without him. His obsession with her only deepened. He couldn't stop thinking about Viviana, about the daughter who carried his blood, his legacy. The child he had tried to erase was thriving, hidden from him, growing up with a life that was nothing like the one he had envisioned. He spent hours in his study, looking over old photographs of his own children, memories of a time when his family had been whole. He wondered how it could have been different if he had made different choices, if he had been a better man. But those thoughts quickly turned bitter. Regret was a useless emotion, he told himself. It didn't change anything. He found himself increasingly distracted in meetings, his mind drifting to Jane's face, her sharp words, the way she had walked away from him without a hint of remorse. He saw her every time he closed his eyes. He could still hear her voice, the finality in her tone when she said Viviana's name, like a quiet declaration that he was no longer a part of their lives. His empire, once invincible, was beginning to show signs of strain. Rivals who had once cowered before him now saw weakness, and they exploited it. His most trusted lieutenants started questioning his decisions, the cracks in his judgment becoming visible. His mind, once a fortress of calculation and strategy, was now consumed by thoughts of Jane and Viviana. The walls that had kept his world intact were crumbling, piece by piece, and he couldn't stop the fall. Every move he made, every decision he took, felt like it was pushing him further away from the man he had once been. He wasn't sure how to stop it, how to undo the damage he had caused. All he knew was that Jane had changed him in ways he couldn't reverse, and the thought of Viviana, his daughter, being so far beyond his reach, was a wound that refused to heal. The meeting had been arranged with clinical precision, a calculated maneuver by Don Giovanni to confront Jane, to get answers he hadn't dared to ask. He had spent weeks, months, preparing for this. But now, as he stood in the sleek modern office that Jane had created for herself, his certainty wavered. The weight of what he had done, of what he had lost, settled like a stone in his chest. Jane stood by the window, her back to him, looking out over the city. The same city that had once been his kingdom, his empire. Now it felt foreign. She had taken something from him. No, she had built something of her own, something that no longer included him. He had underestimated her, and now he had to face the truth. She was no longer the woman he could control. "You're late," Jane said without turning around, her voice sharp but composed. Don Giovanni took a step closer, his shoes clicking against the polished floor, a reminder of the power he had once wielded with ease. But here, in her domain, it felt like a hollow sound. He said nothing, just stood there, watching her with a growing sense of frustration. She had always been a puzzle to him, vulnerable, yes, but with an inner strength he hadn't seen until it was too late. "I've been thinking about you," he finally said, his voice low, almost reluctant. "About everything." Jane's shoulders stiffened. "And what exactly have you been thinking, Don Giovanni? That you could just walk back into my life like nothing happened? Like you didn't throw everything away?" His gaze softened for a moment, but then he forced it away, replaced by that familiar coldness. I never wanted to destroy you. I thought you understood that. But you—" He took a deep breath, frustrated by his inability to articulate what had been tormenting him. "You defied me. You left, and you built something without me, without my permission." Jane turned to face him then, her eyes hard and unwavering. "You don't get it, do you? I didn't leave you because of some whim. I left because you tried to control me, because you tried to control everything. You threatened my family, my future, and I was a fool to believe you loved me at all." Don Giovanni flinched, but he masked it quickly. He had never been one to show vulnerability. Yet there was something in her words, something in the way she looked at him, that stung. "I made mistakes," he said, his voice rough. "But you didn't give me the chance to make it right. You took my daughter from me." At the mention of Viviana, Jane's face hardened, a wall slamming down between them. "She's not yours to take. She's mine, and you never cared for her. Not really." Silence fell between them, thick and heavy. Old wounds reopened, and new emotional boundaries were drawn. For the first time, Don Giovanni saw the extent of the damage he had caused, and in Jane's eyes he saw the truth he had spent years refusing to accept. He was no longer a man who commanded respect. He was a man who had lost everything, and Jane, standing tall in her own strength, had moved beyond him. The air was thick with the remnants of their confrontation, the tension still hanging in the room like smoke. Jane stood at the window, watching the city stretch out before her, feeling the weight of everything that had been said. The confrontation with Don Giovanni had cracked open old wounds. But as the minutes ticked by, she found herself releasing the anger she had carried for so long. It wasn't that she had forgiven him, not yet, maybe never, but she knew now that revenge wouldn't bring her peace. She could feel Viviana's presence in the next room, the soft rustle of her small feet padding across the floor, the sound of a toy clattering. Her daughter was her world now, her reason for everything. The life she had built, the empire she had crafted, was all for Viviana. And no matter how much Don Giovanni had tried to tear it down, Jane knew she had something that could never be taken away. Love. Turning away from the window, Jane walked slowly to the door of Viviana's room. The little girl was sitting on the floor, surrounded by her scattered toys, her face lit with the kind of joy only a child could possess. She looked up, her wide brown eyes sparkling, and smiled when she saw her mother. "Mama!" Viviana cried, reaching out her tiny arms. Jane bent down, gathering her daughter into her arms, holding her close as if to remind herself that this was the future she was fighting for. Viviana's laughter, sweet and innocent, filled the air, and Jane realized then that this was enough. She didn't need the destruction of Don Giovanni to feel validated. She didn't need to see him suffer. For the first time in years, Jane felt something like peace settle in her chest. It wasn't the kind of peace that came from winning, from destroying her enemies. No, this was the kind of peace that came from letting go, from choosing to focus on the good that was right in front of her. "Mama, can we play?" Viviana asked, tugging at her sleeve. Jane nodded, smiling as she set her daughter down, the weight of her past slowly falling away. "You bet, sweetheart. Let's build something together." And in that moment, Jane understood. She had already won. She had built a life, her life, with her daughter, and no amount of vengeance could ever be as fulfilling as this simple, quiet joy. The world that Don Giovanni had spent a lifetime building was crumbling. It wasn't the way he had envisioned it. The collapse hadn't come in a dramatic, explosive wave, but in the quiet unraveling of every thread he'd carefully woven. His empire, once unshakable, had become a hollow shell, the cracks spreading too quickly for him to repair. The board members, who had once hung on his every word, now spoke behind closed doors, their loyalty fractured. His rivals, sensing weakness, closed in with ruthless precision. What had been a fortress of power was now a house of cards, teetering on the brink of destruction. The meetings, the phone calls, the endless negotiations, they all felt like shadows now, distant and unreal. Don Giovanni sat alone in his office, staring at the city skyline he had once dominated. His mind wasn't on business anymore. It was on Jane, and the daughter he had never truly known, Viviana. The name echoed in his mind, a constant reminder of his failures. He had tried to force her out of existence, tried to erase her before she even had the chance to breathe. But now, she existed, alive, thriving, growing up in a world he had no place in. It was a bitter pill to swallow, but it was the truth. He'd thought about going after them, trying to regain control, to make things right, but the more he thought about it, the more he realized the futility of it all. Jane had built a life without him. She had created a world where he didn't belong, where his influence couldn't touch her or their daughter. He could destroy everything he had left, but he would never be able to take away the peace she had found. In the end, Don Giovanni did what he had never done before. He stepped back. He let the empire fall. Slowly at first, then faster, until it all came crashing down, a casualty of his own making. The deals he'd fought so hard for, the alliances he'd crafted, all of it lay in ruins. The weight of it settled in his chest like a physical burden, but there was no anger, no desire to fight. Just a hollow emptiness that mirrored the loss of everything he had once held dear. Meanwhile, Jane was living a life far removed from the wreckage left behind by Don Giovanni. She had spent the last few years building something new, something hers. The company she had started, the life she had built for herself and Viviana, was thriving. Jane had learned to trust her instincts, to lean into the love and the quiet moments that came with being a mother. She spent her days making decisions that mattered, creating a future for her daughter, one that would be free from the shadows of her past. She had no interest in what Don Giovanni was doing, in whether his empire crumbled or not. She had done what she needed to do. She had chosen her daughter, and in doing so, she had chosen peace. The house was quiet now. Viviana asleep in her room, the soft sound of her breathing filling the space. Jane stood by the window, looking out at the city, her thoughts clear. She had left the past behind, the anger, the fear. There was nothing left to prove. She didn't need revenge. She didn't need to rebuild the world that had once been hers to control. She had something better, something that could never be taken from her, her daughter's future. She smiled to herself, knowing that whatever came next, they would face it together. The past had no hold on her anymore. Jane had found the one thing Don Giovanni had lost, peace. And for the first time in a long time, she felt truly free.